Good morning, everybody. I'm Emily. Really excited to see everybody here today, and welcome to the UW Human-Centered Design and Engineering Democracy Design Jam. As Brian said, we do want to cover a few technical housekeeping things before we dive in. So this meeting is being recorded and the final presentation will be recorded. I'm not sure about the office hours, but just wanted to make note that by participating, you will be recorded for all time. We will be using the spotlight video function to highlight the video of speakers and also sharing slides, video, and audio from time to time. So make sure that your media is all up to speed. We're going to ask that people default to having their videos on so that we can see everybody who's in the room. But of course, if you need to take a break, please do so. We're all tired of having cameras on us all the time. So feel free to turn it off if you need to. And like Brian said, we will ask you at certain times to turn it back on. Also, we're going to have everyone on mute by default. And if you have any requests about video and audio or help that you need, feel free to use the chat window either privately or publicly. For the content-based questions, we'll use those to help guide the Q&A periods. And remember that any private messages you send to people through the chat will show up in the transcript. So if you trash talk any speakers, that will show up later. And for social media purposes, please use the hashtag #DemocracyDesignJam. If you know what that means, I'm glad, because I'm not really sure how to use hashtags. Okay, so that's the technical stuff. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And now I can see everybody. Hello.
Hi.
All right, so let's start with what we're here to do. The goal here for this Democracy Design Jam is that by the end of the jam, every team will have designed and given a 5-minute pitch about a virtual strategy that political candidates or constituents or activists, just regular folks, could use to practice democracy during this time of social distancing. We have gotten a really great lineup of speakers and mentors and resources to help you, the teams, through this entire process, all the way from user research through the typical cycle of ideating, prototyping, testing, and iterating. So we're really thrilled about that. A bunch of them are on right now. I just want to thank them up front. I also want to thank the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering for supporting this. I believe that the chair of the department, Professor Keynes, is on. Professor Starbird is one of our guests. We have some visiting faculty who are also on, and then Melissa Ewing, who is the Events and Outreach Manager, has been just a huge support for all of us in making sure that this happens and being our liaison to the department. So thanks. So before we dive into the agenda, I do want to acknowledge that from the perspective of this being a human-centered design and engineering event, I want to ask you all to take a moment and engage in an exercise with me to center not just these hypothetical users or hypothetical humans, but the humanity of each of us in this virtual space. I learned this exercise from a teacher named Minachi a few weeks ago, and I'm going to ask you to turn your videos on in order to participate. So I'll just give you a minute to turn your video back on if you have turned it off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a story, and then I'm going to ask everyone to signal on video how you feel when you're listening to the story using these signs. So if you feel anxious, go like this. If you feel angry, go like this. If you're feeling sad, go like this. And if you're feeling happy, go like this. All right, everybody got it? So anxious, angry, sad, happy. All right, so here's the story. So Brian, okay, you don't have this, oh, turn off the spotlight so people can see each other, if you could do that, Brian. And make sure you go into gallery so you can see how everybody's feeling. Okay, cool. All right, so here's the story. Imagine you're sitting at a bus stop. So maybe you're one of the people who's still using public transportation right now, or maybe you're not. But if you're not, imagine that things have opened up a bit more and you're back on public transportation. You're waiting at the bus stop. You're the only person there. It's someday in the near future. You're hanging out, and you're waiting for the bus, and the bus is late. So you check your phone. Bus is actually 2 minutes late. You're sitting there and you're, flipping through Facebook or whatever you do on your phone while you're waiting for the bus. And then now the bus is 5 minutes late. And so you're like, man, I have to get to work. I have to get to this meeting. My friend is waiting for me. I got to go to the doctor. Where's the bus? And now the bus is 10 minutes late. So how are you feeling? If you haven't already signaled, let's see. Okay. So I see some angry people, some scared people, some people who are laughing. Some people don't care about time at all. Okay. All right. So now let's start this over. So now imagine you're back at the bus stop. You've just gotten there and you're waiting. You're the only person there. And you feel like you've been waiting for a while, and you realize, the bus might be late. So you're starting to get whatever it was you're feeling, angry, sad, nervous. But then all of a sudden, walking down the street, you see your best friend in the whole world, your buddy, your BFF, your soulmate, whoever that person is. You see that person in your mind? Okay. And so and then you hug this person, because in this hypothetical world, we can hug each other. So if you hug this person, or if you're not a hugger, you high five or whatever it is you do when you see people you love. And then, and the bus is actually late. So now it's 2 minutes late, and it's 5 minutes late, and it's 10 minutes late. But how do you feel, even though the bus is late? Yeah, everybody, you're happy, you're catching up, and so you decide, hey, let's just walk together. Wherever we're going, let's just go together. So the point of this exercise is that circumstances that are out of our control can really make us feel anxious or angry, or sad or lonely, or so many things. And there's so much that's out of our control right now in terms of health, the world, politics, everything just feels crazy and out of control sometimes. But when we find connection and solidarity and connect to the humanity and the people we love, those circumstances can turn into actually a source of joy and even creativity. So I wanted to share that story, one, to get us into contact with what it means to really be human when we're centering humans and doing design, but also because this jam was actually born out of this kind of joy and creativity. Brian Boyle, who is now I'm back on Spotlight, thanks Brian. Brian Boyle, who's one of the co-hosts of this event, is one of, you're going to hear from him in a minute, but Brian and I have actually known each other for a really long time, since college. So I wanted to show you a couple of photos. Hang on here. Share screen. This guy. All right. So here's a couple college photos of us. We went to a college formal together, and we're pretending to be whales breaching in a pool. These are from a long time ago, but I wanted to share them because Brian is really one of my favorite humans in the whole world. And our lives paths have really taken us in different directions. He is, I guess not that different, but he's a lawyer in Massachusetts on the East Coast. And I'm a social scientist in Washington State, and we've both gotten married. We started families. We actually don't see each other that much anymore, but we still talk and text almost every day about like really deep things like the role of Christianity in constitutional framing, but also really ridiculous things like these stop motion videos that my kid and Brian have both been making using kids' toys. If you're on the Slack, you'll see one of Brian's excellent stop motion videos. So the idea for this jam started, I'm gonna stop these college photos now, but okay. So the idea for this jam started back in September or October of last year, when Brian and I were talking about how boring and useless the Democratic presidential primary debates were. And we started thinking about alternatives to the traditional debate formats. And I remember one of the ideas we had was like, what if it were like American Gladiators, but for political candidates? And I think that was my idea because I really like American Gladiators. But given my relationship with the department as an alum of the certificate program and a member of the corporate affiliates program, I thought it would be really cool if we ran a design jam with students focused on redesigning debates. But once COVID-19 hit, we realized we weren't sure if we should still go forward with the jam, but actually there were two things that made us convinced that we should move forward. First, the pandemic actually provides a really interesting design challenge, which is informing and connecting with electoral politics when in-person events are not possible. It seems really tough, but it can actually potentially short circuit a lot of the BS of traditional campaign events, which are like overly produced, very performative. There's almost scripts that the candidates assume. You can just like predict what they're gonna say. And now that they don't have those outlets anymore, it's possible that we have this opportunity to short circuit those performances. But maybe even more importantly, I think that this jam can serve as an outlet and focusing mechanism for a lot of people's pent up creative energies, not just around design in general, but around using design to really make a difference. So concentrating that kind of positive energy in one place when we're all feeling so isolated is really exciting to me. It's continued to be exciting to me. And so while the goal of this weekend's jam is to research, design, test, and pitch real ideas that can help shape how we practice democracy, what I really hope is that this place, whatever work we do over the weekend, comes from a joyful and creative place inside of you, and is a great experience for all of us. And I don't think there's anything more human-centered than having that kind of experience together. So that is my welcome. And we are now going to turn to our panel of experts to help set the stage for your user research. So I want to introduce what the panel is for first, and then we'll talk about who the experts are. So the panel is really meant to set the stage for your user research. We're going to provide you a number of different perspectives about who users are in American democracy. So first we'll hear from Brian Boyle on the constitutional foundations for how we understand users or jobs to be done or whatever framework works for you in represented democracy. Then we'll hear from Massachusetts State Representatives Higgins and Zlotnick. Professor Kate Starbird and Dr. Saiph Savage will talk about research and design regarding misinformation and disinformation. And then we'll have some wrap-up thoughts from Dr. Marshall Ganz. It is a lot of perspectives in a short amount of time, so we did provide a note-taking template in the G Drive, the Google Drive, and on Slack to help you keep track of what you're hearing. It's not necessary for you to use this, but it's just sort of a chart that helps you keep track of what you're hearing and potentially take it into the design phase if that's helpful. Okay, so that was a lot of talking. Any questions before we jump into the panels? Let's see, scroll through the chat here. Okay, I think we're good. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian Boyle, who is counsel at American Promise.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Emily, can you give me a thumbs up to make sure you can hear me? All right, awesome. All right, so since we do want to try to get through a number of perspectives in a relatively brief amount of time, I am going to cut to the chase and share my screen. Just one second. What I'm going to focus on today are what I'm calling the constitutional principles that go into democracy. All right, now I apologize. Sorry for being a little grim with my imagery here, but these empty chairs are meant to show that individuals have a key role to play in American democracy. But we have to show up. And if we leave our chairs empty, then the constitutional system won't work. Both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution set forth a fundamental principle, which is that the American people are the ultimate source of power and legitimate authority in our system. The people are sovereign, and this sovereignty is derived, I think, from what we could consider inherent human dignity. So that's kind of at the bedrock of our founding documents. The people are sovereign, but they can come together and vest certain power and authority in a system of government. And what I like about this triangle, besides the fact that it kind of represents the three branches of government under our system, is that I think it's a really interesting constitutional metaphor, because if you look at it, it's like all these fractal patterns that are kind of extending out from the center. And I think of the center as the sovereign people, and then all of those patterns and sub-patterns that arise that are interconnected. It's like the emerging power dynamics that happen in our system. But we should never forget that ultimately it's all coming from the center, or it should be. Now, under our system, we exercise power in a lot of ways. The most direct way that we exercise power is at the ballot box through voting. And the reason we even have voting is because this is a way, the theory of the founders was that it's a way of creating a connection between the sovereign people and the officials that are supposed to be representing their interests and serving their needs. But another way that we exercise power is through the First Amendment. And I just want to tell everybody, I'm going to put up an image that contains some language that might disturb you, but it's kind of to make my point. So the freedom of speech, this is a scene actually from some protests that took place outside of the funeral of a Marine who was killed in action. And these were people who, on religious grounds, were protesting what they considered to be American immorality. And by a vote of 8-1, the Supreme Court found that this speech was protected under our First Amendment, because our First Amendment protects all sorts of speech, including offensive and provocative speech. The point that I want us to focus on today, though, is that we shouldn't forget that the real heart of the First Amendment isn't the provocative, outrageous speech. It's the speech that enables self-determination and self-government. That's why this amendment was included in the Constitution. And we protect freedom of speech because we want to protect that. And our ability to make our voices heard on matters of public importance is one of the ways that we keep our connection to our elected officials. I mean, what I'm saying is that basically the First Amendment is supposed to be creating an overall speech environment that promotes true and free expression. So when it comes to freedom of speech, I think that a 21st century problem that our founders couldn't have anticipated is that the real risk these days isn't like overt government censorship, although that does happen. The real risk is that we all have so much information coming at us and our attention time is scarce. And I created this ridiculous image just to show in a given week, like all of the free time that we're supposed to have to like process information and participate in democracy in a deliberative way. It's like minuscule compared to all the other commitments we have. And so I think of this attention scarcity as a problem that we need to design around, not only for our own sanity, but for the sake of democracy. So what can we do? I don't have any clear answers, but I do have a dog. And I put this image of my dog here because I think she's inviting us all to try to sniff out design solutions that maybe create more opportunities or openings for truth and love in our public discourse. And I know that that sounds maybe a little hokey, but I really believe that if we can use our communications tools to highlight what's best in us, we can sort of find a silver lining in these pandemic conditions. So that is the end of my constitutional overview. I was just going to say a few words about our next two speakers. you'll be hearing, as Emily said, from Massachusetts State Representative Natalie Higgenson and John Zlotnick. And I had the pleasure of getting to know both of them before this pandemic really took hold. And I think you'll see that they're both incredibly smart and compassionate and dedicated to their communities. But for me, what I love most about them is that they lead from their heart. And I think that's something that we all need right now. So just a quick sort of practical note that you should be aware of is that in Massachusetts, state legislators are elected every 2 years. And so in addition to their responsibilities in the legislature and providing constituent services, they're also trying to like campaign right now too. And so I thought that presents, all those things present a constellation of challenges for elected officials. And we invited them here to talk about it. So with that, I will invite Representative Higgenson to unmute herself and we will spotlight her.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Natalie Higgenson. I'm the state representative in Leominster. And first, I want to thank Brian for including me in this because more than anything, I want to learn from all of you because I'm mourning what campaign should look like. And Emily said, I think we're wearing the same shirt, right? Yeah, perfect. So you get to see me in my home casual, which is a variety of mostly Elizabeth Warren t-shirts and then Hamilton t-shirts. So I want to talk about kind of the thought process that we're going through and re-envisioning what our campaign is going to look like in 2020. And honestly, like mourning something that I was so excited for 2020 election season, right? Like this was going to be the best year. We were going to have a great time. We have lots of races that I care about, including mine. But I want to put in perspective kind of how I came into politics and my own experience running in Massachusetts, because I think that that also gives some insight into what I'm grappling with right now. So I won my first race in 2016 with Donald Trump on the ballot. I ran as the first openly progressive Democrat in my district, the youngest person to win in my district, and the first LGBTQ person in my district. So when I decided to run, it was February of 2016. My predecessor had announced in the paper he wasn't going to run for re-election. He decided he was going to retire at the end of the session. And so in February of 2016, I called my parents and then my then boyfriend of 8 months and said, I think I'm running for state rep. Will you support me? And they said, sure. And I said, will you help? And they were, what do we got to do? Like lawn signs? Is that how you run for office? And I said, I don't know. We're going to figure it out. So I did a grassroots campaign boot camp for Democratic women running for office called Emerge. That is now national, but started in Massachusetts. And my mom, my aunt, and my partner did a weekend grassroots campaign training from a group locally called Mass Alliance that runs grassroots campaign trainings. And we relied on door knocking, right? Canvassing, showing up in front of people at a time where they like had to talk to us. And in my community, we're really surprised that we were taking that much time and attention to them. So many things that folks are battling with in terms of time constraints, that showing up to them, often they would be like, I didn't want to bother you, but now that you're here, I have these questions. And so that was really effective. And we needed to do that. We needed to be efficient with our time. We needed to be efficient with our resources. And we needed to have those conversations for a first-time candidate who was running against a 20-year sitting city councilor who had the support of the outgoing state rep, right? Like it was an uphill battle. We weren't winning except for on election day when we won by 38 votes. I never, ever want to win a race that closely. 38 votes, it was 0.5% between the two of us, but we earned every single one of those votes. And I'm thankful for the 1,475 people who took a chance on me my first election. and believing that we were stronger together and that we needed to share ideas and support each other. Fast forward to 2018. I was confronted with the reality that no matter how good I thought I was doing my job, I had twice weekly office hours, Monday nights at the Leominster Library for an hour and a half from 5:30 to 7, Friday morning office hours from 7 to 8 in accessible ways, trying to figure out how to connect with folks who really don't know what their state rep is or does, or why we're in elected office. And in 2018, I continued to do the canvassing, and folks had no idea who I was or what I did. And so again, like trying to help folks understand how to participate in democracy in something that I care really deeply about. We represent 42,000 people, right? We have our feet on the ground in our communities, and we're making government accessible for them. Fast forward to this year, I'm trying to figure out how to access folks, knowing that social media is a help, right? I can go Facebook Live and do Zoom coffee hours instead of doing house parties. Like, there are ways for us to be able to do this, but it doesn't capture all of our constituents, right? And I'm really excited to see what you all come up with, because we're right now trying to figure out how do we connect with folks at a time where they still feel like most of my constituents feel really disconnected from government, feel frustrated by it, and feel like government, at least for sure at the national level, doesn't represent them or speak well. And I know I'm running out of time, but I do want to give one little plug. It's really exciting, and thanks again for Brian for inviting me, because I met Professor Marshall Ganz more than a decade ago when I was a student at UMass Amherst, and did a program with another professor that he knows, Arthur Keene, where we did grassroots community organizing in our communities, and it was largely a thought project between Professor Marshall Ganz and my professors. So it's really great to be able to come back and do this. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Representative Higgins. That's awesome. And now I will spotlight Rep. Zlotnick.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Brian, for the invitation. So a little background on me. I was first elected in 2012. And my path to public office, I was working as an intern for a number of years in the State House for my hometown rep. And he had retired. His seat had been won by a Republican. And I had been trying to recruit someone to run against him. And when that sort of fell flat, I decided to run myself. I was still a senior in college. I went to, since Natalie mentioned, I was just going to leave it at UMass, but since you said Amherst, I'll say UMass Lowell. And I was 21 at the time, and I won my first election beating that incumbent. And now I'm up for re-election to my fifth term. And I think I'll break this down into sort of two areas of challenge and opportunity. One, the campaign, and the other side, the office. And I think, and Natalie actually touched on this, but there's a big difference between running for office your first time and once you've been in a while. I think back to the things I did to win my first, really two races. I'm not sure I could realistically do any of those things right now. The face-to-face interactions, the door-to-door, going to multiple events, and working the crowd, going to as many as I could. All those types of things really aren't an opportunity. They're just not there. And even there's been a sort of ongoing debate about can we do door knocking? How could we do it? And I mean, right now at least my campaign is leaning no. But to contrast that, I mean, I think it's different for those of us who've been in office a little bit and have our list developed, have some campaign infrastructure built up underneath us. have a social media presence already established. It's, I think it's sort of night and day to, a first-time candidate, just starting to run and trying to introduce themselves to the community. I think those are two completely different challenges. I think for us who already have that infrastructure and all that built up, one, I think it's easier. And two, I think the challenge is just making sure that we're utilizing that, to the best possible. The flip side of that is the office work and constituent services, primarily. And, like Natalie, I have a district office in Gardner. Both of our districts are quite a bit a ways from the state capitol. So I would say not everyone has a district office, but most of us out here in Central Mass and Western Mass keep some sort of district office, which is, obviously closed right now. And so we've been operating everything, phone, email, social media. We've had people contact us through various means. But one shortcoming we've identified from all this is that we don't really have a good way to reach out to people who don't support us. Most of our social media presence is sort of geared, with a campaign focus. The same thing with any lists that we have. So in terms of getting information out, to the, our general constituents and the public at large, there's really not a good way to do that, because people get information through so many different ways at this point that it's difficult for us to sort of wrangle all that. So those are sort of the range of challenges that we've seen in the first couple months of that. And I don't see, some of those certainly changing anytime soon. We're going to have to, find ways to adapt. And I think there's certainly, technological ways that we can do that. So I'm curious to see what you guys are going to come up with. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. And just so everybody who is participating remembers this, that both Representative Higgins and Zlotnick will be on our judging panel tomorrow as well. Emily, let me turn it back over to you.
Sure, we're about to transition over to hearing about misinformation and disinformation. I just wanted to ask Representative Higgins and Zlotnick a question about, typically in campaigns, and also probably when you're in office, there are the people who are solidly in your camp, people who are solidly in the other camp, and then there's the people in between that can sort of sway back and forth. Now that we're all sort of tied to social media for information in our computers, which of those groups do you feel like you would prioritize, and how are they affected by this kind of informational bubbling that's happening?
Yeah, I think I can start. Definitely, I care about the folks who are in the middle, keeping in touch and keeping my connection with my, for sure, supporters, but the folks who maybe aren't familiar with me. Something that helped me in my first term, and I don't think they thought it was going to help, is I had 6 attack mailers that were just based in complete false and misleading information. I couldn't, as a first-time elected official, mail to my entire district 6 times, right? But they for sure knew I was their state rep, and the people who were really angry called me. At one point, over 400 calls. And I called every single one of those people back to explain what the truth was. And I have to say, I've been quoted in my paper as like, thanks, Mass Fiscal, for mailing in my district, because I'm getting people to call me who would never, ever reach out to a state rep's office. There's a way to look at it as a glass half full. We had great conversations. And now when they get flyers from that organization, they know they're probably not based in fact. And they call and say, hey, Natalie, I got this mailing. What are they trying to say? Like what actually happened here. So, so there's ways to turn it around.
That's a great example. Thanks.
And yeah, I think Natalie she really nailed it. And, the other thing too is that, and I don't know if this is the same experience she had, but we had a much higher percentage of people than I would have expected who were, I was attacked by the same organization prior to Natalie. Once she got elected, they sort of moved on to her. But I was surprised at the number of people who weren't aware that they were attack mailers. I'd have people come up to me for days after and, you know, be like, oh, hey, I got your mailer. And at the beginning, I was like, did you read it? And they'd be, oh, no, you know, I just saw your name and face and threw it out, you know, so kind of questions the money we spend on mail. You know, I think Natalie's right in terms of where the, you know, the priority is to make sure, obviously, I don't know the numbers for her district, but I'm sure it's pretty close to mine, where my district is slightly over 50% unenrolled voters, not enrolled in either party. And most states call them independents. We call them unenrolled in Massachusetts. So, you know, you really have to keep an eye on that and make sure that you're, you know, really keeping your finger on the pulse of that section as much as possible, because, you know, especially in our part of the state, they really do, you know, swing elections.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. All right. We're going to transition now over to hearing from Professor Kate Starbird. Her research focuses on crisis informatics, and she's going to be speaking about misinformation and disinformation. Professor Starbird, take it away.
All right, thank you. Yes, I'm a professor at HCDE, and I've been a researcher of sort of how social media are used during crisis events for several years now. More recently, we've been focusing on the spread of misinformation and even now disinformation in this context, which includes natural disasters, acts of terrorism, and now pandemics. As all of you are, we have been experiencing COVID-19, and both as an individual who's, you know, worried about it, and as a researcher who's trying to think a lot about it. One of the things we know about crisis events, and we can see in this event for sure, is that they're characterized by this kind of uncertainty and anxiety, and that kind of uncertainty and anxiety makes us vulnerable to spreading misinformation, and actually makes us vulnerable to hearing and absorbing disinformation as well. And I want to, I talk a lot about this context, and then people will ask me at the end after I've done a whole speech about like, what's disinformation? I'm like, oh, wait a minute, let me start with that. It's like the difference between misinformation, disinformation, because today I want to focus on disinformation, but the difference is important. So misinformation is information that's false, but not necessarily intentionally false, while disinformation is information that is false or misleading for some kind of objective, a political objective, a financial objective, a reputational objective, or something like that. When we start to think about pervasive disinformation, which is something that we're facing both like acutely with COVID-19 and sort of more generally in some of our information spaces, it actually has a particular, like, it's actually in some ways an attack on democracy and democratic institutions. It's particularly sort of a threat for what it means to come together as a society. Disinformation attacks sort of our trust in information. It attacks democratic institutions directly and indirectly. It attacks media, government, the veracity or the legitimacy of elections. It actually is also an attack on our sort of shared reality or our common ground. So we lose that common ground that we need to come together on to make collective decisions. And we no longer have the same reality because it's been distorted by these sort of disinformation campaigns. And I know that's kind of a big theoretical way to look at it. We've been seeing this kind of acutely, but when you step back and you start to see the pervasive use of these things, we can see sort of society coming apart at these fault lines and these fault lines being exploited for political gain. So to take that a little bit into the COVID context and then to kind of speak back to this group, we're already beginning to see sort of COVID-19 misinformation, disinformation begin to blend in with election 2020. And those things, more and more, the misinformation that we're seeing is actually disinformation. It's intentional. It's shaped around political objectives. And it's actually a growing part of the kind of discourse around COVID-19. One of the things I'm worried about, and we've seen a little bit of, is that COVID-19 can be sort of a portal down the rabbit hole where people are encountering misinformation, disinformation for the first time, and it can lead them into these ecosystems that are going to turn increasingly political, even if they don't seem political now. To some of us that are encountering us, most of us can see that are here maybe, but a lot of people can't. they're going to turn increasingly political and misleading as we go. So one example of this, many of you perhaps saw the Facebook post last week about the Plandemic video in your feeds. It was actually a campaign that we saw developing a few weeks prior, part of a larger campaign to sow distrust in the response efforts, to attack Dr. Fauci specifically, and also to sow distrust in a future COVID-19 vaccine, which is going to have some really horrible public health impacts down the line, possibly. So this video actually went viral by moving through different online communities. Went through far-right communities, a few far-left communities, anti-vaccine communities, conspiracy theory communities, on Facebook, Twitter, and elsewhere. And those communities are really important when we think about election politics. So these communities are constituted by, and in some cases, very dense networks of activists who have different kinds of connections. These are people that have been in these communities for a while in some cases. And these activists can be activated to share politicized narratives, to spread disinformation, to pick up certain kinds of campaigns. And these networks have actually been laid down through different kinds of campaigns and other pieces of information spread since 2012 and probably beforehand. And they're solid. And so if you're designing for sort of a silent majority or for candidates kind of coming into online spaces for this first time because they've had to be sort of forced out of the offline spaces, how do you contest with this loud and very networked minority of voices that are kind of, the infrastructure's already there. They've been kind of reinforced through other campaigns in the past, and now they're ready to activate in this kind of environment. And so I guess that's what I'm most interested in this case is like, how do the candidates that are coming into these spaces face up against these kind of existing networks or communities of activists? And they're in all sorts of different varieties online, and they come together around different ideas, and some of them are anti-vaccine, but some of them are just, you know, concerned about some other niche issue. And then they've begun to kind of be shaped into some larger political campaigns that may not align with some of the values that people here have and are trying to promote in society. All right, I'm going to cede the floor on that.
Thanks, Dr. Starbird. It is a very important and, to me, frightening question, but hopefully one that we will be able to dig into as a group. And then also next we have Dr. Saiph Savage, whose lab is designing some tools to combat misinformation and disinformation, and has been for a while. So I'll turn it over to Saiph.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. So as Emily mentioned, my lab has been developing systems, especially thinking about how we can organize citizens to start to fight disinformation. And this is what I'm going to briefly talk with you about today. So my slides are, okay. So a question that I'm highly passionate about is thinking, where is the solution to stopping disinformation? Something to consider is that most current approaches assume that when people engage with the news, people believe that the news holds factual information about the world around them. As a result, most solutions have currently been focused on fact-checking tools, tools that will tell people this news is fake, this news is real. However, despite this, a lot of these tools have not actually been very good at removing disinformation. We're still plagued with disinformation. And as Prof Starbird mentioned, this has had a chilling effect on citizen participation, and it is helping to undermine our democracy. I therefore argue that in order to design effective solutions, we need to first understand how are people engaging with disinformation. And so through our data analysis, what we found is that one of the most effective techniques that people are doing to engage others in disinformation is through conspiracy theories. Therefore, part of my systems research focuses on addressing people's conspiratorial thinking. Now, prior work has found that a way that we can get people to stop engaging in conspiracy theories is by prompting them to focus on solution to problems. So based on this idea, I propose the following architecture. We're gonna have citizens who, for instance, as Kate mentioned, might be highly engaged in disinformation and these conspiracy theories. My research focuses on prompting these individuals, triggering them, and using computation to now organize them for social good. I have been designing my systems for different types of personas, which I focus on governments, civic organizations, activist groups, and also citizens themselves. I'm helping these different actors in order to be able to organize citizens for different social good activities. Some of the social good activities I focus on organizing citizens revolve around helping them to build infrastructure for the blind, helping them to rebuild rural communities so that they can start to build new infrastructure and create the society that they want to see in these rural communities. I've also been focused on organizing citizens to actively oppose and fight disinformation. For instance, exposing others to visual news bias that might exist. Finally, I have been also organizing citizens to help each other develop their digital skills if they're working on gig marketplaces and also earn higher wages. And so overall, what I would like you to take from this is that you can focus your systems on different personas, different actors. Some of them might be governments, but also they might be activist groups. They might also be civic organizations, or you can think about empowering citizens themselves. And thank you, I'm very excited to be here, and thank you, Emily.
Thanks very much, Saiph. Appreciate your expertise and sharing with us a different idea about not just using information, but sort of nudges. All right, so we're going to turn it over now to Dr. Marshall Ganz. Marshall is a senior lecturer at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's also a longtime mentor of mine. I'm super excited to have him be here. Marshall, one of the first things I knew about Marshall is that he actually dropped out of college, dropped out of Harvard to go down to Mississippi for Freedom Summer. And he was very heavily involved in this civil rights movement down in the South. Then spent several years working with Cesar Chavez in the farm workers movement, spent some time in the political electoral arena, then came back to Harvard, which is where I met him. And then most recently helped shape up the entire framework for developing leadership through the Camp Obama campaigns of the 2007-2008. So I'm going to ask Marshall to kind of reflect on what we've heard, thinking about what lessons from social movements we can take to this current moment and leading us into the future. So Marshall, thanks for joining.
Hi, Emily. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. I like your shirt.
And Natalie, nice to see you. Good to see you again after many years. Yeah.
All right, so the first question I have for you is that the uncertainty and anxiety of this moment seems to be making more of us vulnerable to these disinformation campaigns, many of which are driven by organized bad actors to further undermine public trust. So one of the solutions that Saiph proposed was designing solutions to nudge people out of conspiratorial thinking. And I was wondering about your thoughts on, is that a good way to build public trust, and or what other solutions would you point us toward?
I guess, I mean, I think that's fine. I guess from my perspective, one of the core reasons for all this vulnerability is the thinness of our relationships with one another. And that comes from so many different directions. It's sort of turning people into data points, which is often what political marketing does, as well as marketing in generally. The kind of isolation that creates, the individualized, sort of the sort of radical individualism and all that introduces an enormous amount of insecurity, disorientation, and it's problematic. And it can even get sort of pathological, which I think is one of the reasons for the appeal of things like Trump, but with other factors. Now, to me, one of the really striking things that's happening right now is that with the emphasis on physical distancing, because I don't think of it as social distancing, I think it's physical distancing, it lifts up the significance of relational proximity. And I think we are fortunate to have access to a technology that we can use, namely this one that we're using, to actually create a lot of relational proximity. And to me, that's really quite refreshing, because a lot of the way that the new tech has, that the tech's been used has been to anonymize people, either through social media or digital mobilization, rather than bringing people into relationship with one another, which is the fundamental democratic practice. I mean, when de Tocqueville was talking about democracy in America, the whole point was the significance of association, of people associating with each other as a source of learning, of coming out of your individual interest into a broader understanding of interest, of developing the affective bonds that can promote solidarity, and of also creating the kind of interdependence that can lead to power in a democratic setting. So for me, this is an opportunity to sort of reassert the significance of relationality. I think it's been happening on its own. People have been, Zooming with everybody. I teach a distance learning class that I've been teaching for a number of years. I have 140 students from about 25 countries right now in that class. And they're all doing organizing projects. They all started out with regular organizing projects. So we have become sort of a school of adaptation since the virus hit in how to adapt from offline to online, but with the same core focus of relationship building. And, you can get a lead on this. I appreciated what John said about the significance of already having an infrastructure as opposed to not having one. Hugely different, an enormous advantage, because in politics, the critical thing is your list. You need to have a list of who the people are that ultimately you want to get to the polls to vote, whether it's polls or whether it's early voting or whether it's vote by mail. But you create a list. Now you have a voter list, but voter list doesn't have email. So there we have a challenge to do it online. On the other hand, people have social networks of their own. And that opens up a possibility of really one of the oldest organizing tools ever, which was the house meeting, where you recruit a host who then invites people that they know to their home, and then you go and make a presentation, and then 3 of them invite people to their, it's like Tupperware parties. We used that to actually, for Nancy Pelosi's election in 1987, it was a special election. They had 6 weeks in San Francisco. We did 81 house meetings in 3 weeks, and out of that came our hosts, our precinct leaders, and also our volunteers to then create a Get Out the Vote organization 3 weeks later, so that we won that primary election. It's the last contested election she was involved in. But if you listen to Obama's race speech, he also tells the story about this young woman named Ashley at the end of that speech, which was a house meeting in South Carolina that was being used. And you can do online house meetings just as an instance. I mean, people can invite people. You can have those sessions. You can ask them to invite others, and you can work people's social networks. And one thing, we did this kind of a campaign for Howard Dean in New Hampshire in 2003. We asked everyone to make a list of 50 people they knew. And you say, oh, I don't know 50 people. It turns out most people do, because then you get past just the very immediate strong ties to some of the weaker ties. And that's important in order to fan out and deepen the networks to which you can get access. So you can imagine a whole sort of house meeting, list building, social network building kind of campaign. Already people have been doing what they call relational organizing, where they ask people to reach out to people they know to motivate them to turn out to vote and so forth. People have been experimenting with that in various campaigns. This is a variation on that. And the fact people are at home makes them more accessible. People have even begun answering phones again, I understand. That sort of fell out of use for a long time. And so there is this kind of appetite for relational connection that I think we can make work for us. And for me, it's an opportunity for people to kind of take ownership of the technology rather than being owned by the technology, which I think has too often been the case in the past. So I think we got a great opportunity to be creative and adaptive in learning this. Just one last thought. In this distance learning class I teach, in the fall. It's on public narrative, which is how to tell a story of self, us, now. It's about making emotional connection. I had a student, and I also teach it in the classroom. I had a student from Norway who came to visit Kennedy School, and she came to class, the real class, and I said, well, what did you think about the difference? Not the real class, the physically proximate class. What did you think? She said, well, actually, online was more intimate. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, I'm sitting in the class, I'm seeing the backs of a lot of people's heads. You're up there in the front kind of talking. And when I'm on Zoom, I can see everyone's faces. And I see the tears, and I can see the laughter, and I can feel what I'm part of. So this technology is not a poor imitation of something else. It offers new possibilities. And I think that's where the innovative and creative moment that we're in can really just do enormous, can really strike out in some very new and promising directions.
Thank you so much, Marshall. As always, a balm and an inspiration for moving forward, not just alone, but building power. We have just a couple of minutes. We're probably gonna go over a little bit, if that's all right with folks, just so we have time for some questions. Feel free, again, y'all are relatively quiet in the chat, but please do post your questions and just comments to each other. I would like to ask a question of Dr. Starbird and Dr. Savage in response to what Marshall was saying about the importance of both strong and weak relationships right now. I think a real situation that a lot of us find ourselves in is people we know and love or just work with or something, they are getting drawn into these kind of misinformation tunnels, right? Where you see people kind of falling away from you. And it's sort of hard to know, how do you respond to that in the moment? So, like, if you feel somebody falling away from you, what has your research shown about what kinds of solutions may be helpful that build on actual real life relationships to combat misinformation and disinformation?
Yeah, so I mean, I can take a stab at this, not from my research, but there's been some great research going on from Letitia Bodie and her colleagues on corrections of medical misinformation and other kinds of things. We, over the last, 10 years, we've been hearing that there's this backfire effect, that if we correct people, they're just gonna dig in their heels and it's not gonna work. And I think that's really encouraged people to not engage in these spaces. And more we're finding that the backfire effect doesn't play out. It doesn't play out in all sorts of different ways. It's very contextual, and they've rarely found it in some of the follow-up studies that have been done. And so now we're really moving to more of a like, okay, we do need to figure out how to help people from falling down these rabbit holes. I think it may be really hard to pull people back up once they're really into those communities and that becomes part of their identity. But as they're drifting down, there are opportunities for us to engage. And one of the first things about engaging that I've been recommending is do it with empathy. Acknowledge that we're all really vulnerable to misinformation right now. Most of us have shared something that was not true about COVID-19. It's just what's going on. So approach with empathy and kind of understanding, and to try to engage in a way that gets the conversation going, and maybe keeps the conversation going, even if the person doesn't necessarily agree at first. They might come back to you 2 weeks from now on a different thing. What about this one? Even though they reject in the moment. But really, just to keep those relationships going, don't cut them. Let them know that you don't agree, but also that you still care about them, and that you're hoping to keep that discourse going. I think that's really, really important. And there's been some great articles at The Atlantic and some other places in the last few weeks with different kinds of recommendations for exactly how to engage, specifically around the pandemic video, but I think that can be applied more widely to conspiratorial belief, more broadly in some of these other different narratives that are spreading.
Thanks. As a follow-on question to Marshall, so relationships can be used sort of remedially in this way, right, to deal with something that's happening that might be negative. But one thing that I'm always really interested in about the perspective you bring is that relationships aren't just these feel-good things. They can actually be a source of power, and that can sort of help, in a preventative way, make us less vulnerable in the first place, as you were kind of pointing to. So what thoughts do you have about the relationships that we're having, you know, through Zoom cocktail hours, or people are doing grocery delivery or those kinds of things, how do those relationships turn into something that that represents some sort of constituent power and not just, you know, people being nice to each other? Oh, Marshall, you're muted. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Am I unmuted now?
Good. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. In the world of organizing, we distinguish between private relationships and public relationships, and it's not that one is less than the other. They're just different. Private relationships we think of as intimate. They're based on intimacy. They're about loving one another, liking one another. Public relationships are based on respect. They're based on mutual commitment to a common purpose. This is much more what de Tocqueville is talking about, those kinds of relationships. When we do organizing, that's what we're building. We're building civic relationships, relationships based on commitment to common purpose. And so it means when we sort of the basic tool is the one-on-one meeting. And one of the core things we teach is about story of self. And the story of self is about a way to articulate and a way to learn people's, your own and other people's sources of value, your experiences, not philosophical statements. Where did you learn to care? Where did you learn to hope? Dave Fleischer does this in what he calls deep canvassing. It's a whole other mode that's been developed, especially by the LGBTQ community, going into sort of hostile neighborhoods and figuring out how to have conversations, is getting into actually some depth of engagement with one another, so that you can begin to find common value sources and then perhaps make a commitment to work with one another based on those shared values. I mean, it's a little, you know, more to it than that, but in a way, not that much. But it's the significance of interpersonal relationships that then lead to commitments. Commitment is the source of power because it's commitment to one another, but then it's commitment to other people. You know, it's one of the things that was missing from a lot of the mobilizations like Tahrir Square and others, where people were just aggregated and deployed and then disaggregated, but they weren't connected to each other in any committed way. And so they never created a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts. They never created an organized constituency. And that's where the challenge is creating those opportunities for commitment. And, you know, I've found that people volunteer or make commitments not based on whether it's easy, but on whether it's meaningful, whether it's valuable. You know, we often say, well, it'll only take half an hour a year and you can change a child's life. Well, first of all, we don't believe it. And secondly, it's not true. And it trivializes the whole thing. We respond when we think it will matter and when we think our participation will matter. And so the challenge in these kinds of conversations is to be real about that there is a way in this context, in this election, that you matter. You know, not just you matter, but like the hours you're going to put in, or the creativity you're going to contribute, or the responsibility that you can take. And that will make a difference in the outcome of the election, because that's the other thing people want to know. And so not as a certainty, but as a possibility. Because if there isn't any hope attached to it, you're not going to motivate people to do anything. And hope is not happy talk. Hope is the sense of possibility. Something could be if we act and bring it into being. So, you know, I think that's where sort of this shift happens. And you can do that online just as well as you can do it offline. We've been doing it. We've been seeing people do it. In Australia, they've been having these 1,000-person picket lines online. It's kind of amazing the kinds of creativity that people have found. But again, I really want to emphasize it's about commitments we make to each other. It's about commitments we make to other people, not just commitments to ideas. Because an idea doesn't have your back, another person can. And that's sort of where the power really can come from.
Thank you so much, Marshall. We do have a couple of questions from the chat about sort of who are the right people to design for regarding misinformation and disinformation. We are 6 minutes over, so I think maybe I'll take one of these questions and ask, I'd like to hear from Representative Higgins and Zlotnick about kind of how do you focus on who you target in terms of your messaging or who you're reaching out to. Let's see, this question is it more effective to empower those who have relationships with people drifting toward misinformation or disinformation, so people who have those relationships, or is it to try to create solutions that go directly to those who are drifting? So I think this speaks to, you know, this idea again of prioritizing different types of people who are in your world. Representative Higgins and Zlotnick, do you have any thoughts on this? I was particularly drawn, Representative Higgins, you were talking about all the one-on-one calls that you were making. So that develops a relationship between you and that person. Do you also try to do a sort of laddered approach where you try to reach out to people who themselves have relationships with others?
Yeah, so I think it's a little bit of both. Rep Zlotnick had to hop off, but he'll be back tomorrow night.
Okay.
So I think, right, we target our voters. I'm not going to go and talk to someone who's like a diehard Republican, because they're not going to be super pumped about me showing up. And but for the folks who are in the middle, who maybe choose both ballots and are truly independent or are unenrolled and lean Democratic, those are the folks that we really want to make sure are with us. And then we use our volunteers to really make sure that they're reaching out to their networks and doing these kinds of house parties and bringing folks who they think probably, if they had a chance to meet me, would be in my camp. So it's really just trying to figure out, the only thing that you have in campaigns, right, that you run out of is time. You can buy more people, you can raise more money. It's not fun, right? It's not the most, like, fundraising is my least favorite part of my campaign activities. But the only thing that you run out of that you cannot get back is time. So it's really thinking about how are you the most efficient and reaching out for, you want to make sure that the folks who are solidly in your camp are showing up to vote on election day. And you want to make sure that the folks who are probably going to show up and are really good voters, but you're not sure where they fall, make sure that they're voting for you. So you want to make sure that you're reaching out to them as many times in as many different ways so that you actually get a connection with them.
Thank you. That's a great perspective. All right, we are going to, for me, I just want to say, you know, a big takeaway for me here is, one, what Marshall was just saying about, don't make it easy for people. People aren't trying to do easy. People are trying to do meaningful, right? And so when we make commitments to each other that are meaningful, that's what generates more commitment. And on the other hand, or maybe not on the other hand, but on the, you know, something that goes in partnership with that is exactly what Representative Higgins was just saying about how do we, you also have quantity, right? So the quality of the relationships is really important, but there's also for anybody who's running for office, at the end of the day, it's about how many votes do you get? So these are things that don't have to be in tension, but sometimes as designers, we think that they are in opposition to each other. And I really want to encourage everybody as you're moving forward, don't just think about the numbers. The numbers are important, but also remember that each of those numbers is a person and each of those people has their own story. So those are sort of my closing thoughts for this session. I want to thank all of our panelists for spending a little bit over an hour with us this morning or afternoon or wherever you are. Feel free to keep the chat going during the break. We're going to take a 10-minute break and come back at 10:20 to get more into the nuts and bolts of how the jam's going to work. And I just want to say thank you again to all the panelists and to the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.